This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to continue to learn to play the Hamilcar portion of Hannibal and Hamilcar. Hannibal and Hamilcar was designed by Mark Simonich and Yaro Andruskevich and published by Phalanx in 2018. This game requires 2 players and takes from 1 to 8 hours to play. This is the second episode of the tutorial series focused on the Hamilcar portion of Hannibal and Hamilcar. However, since Hamilcar builds upon most of the rules from Hannibal, it's necessary to have seen all 5 episodes preceding this episode. This episode will focus in Hamilcar's differences in the phases of gameplay. So if you've seen all the earlier episodes and you're ready to learn more about Hamilcar, then let's jump right in. While Hamilcar has a more focused map and new gameplay elements, this game still shares most of the same rules with Hannibal. Rather than rehash everything you just saw in earlier episodes of this tutorial series, I'm going to highlight the updates to each phase of gameplay. Let's walk through a high-level overview of the changes, and then I will illustrate each change in its respective game phase. First things first, in Hamilcar, Rome has the initiative, and they can choose who goes first each turn. The reinforcement phase has the bulk of the changes to incorporate new combat units and warship placement, as well as managing the new rules for generals. Next, we will quickly update the changes in card hand numbers in the deal cards phase. In the strategy phase, there's a number of new ways to bank and spend operation points with supply trains, as well as some other changes. Following that, in winter attrition, there are some additional impacts for naval units and protective measures with supply trains. Political isolation remains the same as Hannibal, with the exception that Carthage goes first and then Rome. Finally, in the victory check phase, there's an additional political implication with the war chest segment. And that's our battle plan for this tutorial. Now let's take a closer look at each of these game phases. The reinforcement phase differs greatly from Hannibal due to the new map and focus on naval conflicts. First, let's walk through Carthage's reinforcement steps. First, Carthage can place 1 ready warship at port, or if they have 5 existing ready warships, they may instead place 1 combat unit in Carthage. Second, Carthage may place 1 combat unit with any general or at any walled city currently not under siege. And finally, when political markers are placed on the Miat, the player for Carthage can earn additional combat units as well. These earned combat units can be placed in Carthage at this time, or the Miat combat unit bonus can be directly converted on a 1-to-1 basis for ready warships. While on the topic of the Miat, let's pause for a moment and learn how this panel works. The Miat is roughly Carthage's version of the Senate in the First Punic War. However, one significant advantage that Carthage has over Rome is that they can place political influence in the Miat. When the player for Carthage puts down a card for operation points, rather than placing control markers on empty spaces and provinces, they can instead place those markers on empty spaces on the Miat. Every turn, the Miat holds back 2 generals and 2 combat units from play. To unlock these bonuses and bring them into the game, the player for Carthage must place political markers on either side of the appropriate icon. A combat unit symbol rewards 1 combat unit during the reinforcement phase, and a general icon adds an additional general during the reinforcement phase. An important point to remember is that every turn the generals are essentially cleared from the game board. New generals are then assigned to the game board based on the next general on the turn track and any draws from the mercenary pool. The Miat allows 1 general per turn as a base, and then an opportunity to field 2 additional generals by populating spaces on the panel. For example, placing a PC marker on the upper left-hand corner and the upper right-hand corner unlocks 1 additional combat unit during the reinforcement phase. Placing a PC marker on the upper right-hand corner and the lower right-hand corner unlocks an additional general. Once the player for Carthage has placed 3 PC markers on the Miat, a PC marker can then be placed in the center space to earn the provincial point on the political control track. So far, this all is pretty straightforward, but there are some risks to consider. If Carthage suffers political impacts that forces them to remove PC markers from the game board, they must first be removed from the Miat. This represents the Council's displeasure with the player's current military efforts and a withdrawal of support. The player for Carthage can choose where to remove the PC markers. However, removing markers is also potentially going to remove bonuses during Carthage's reinforcement phase, and most likely have impacts on the provincial points scored by controlling the Miat on the political control track. Naturally, these spaces can be repopulated with PC markers again to win back the Miat Council support and gain bonuses. Another game mechanic of the Miat that the Carthage player must utilize is the ability to unlock their great generals. These generals are Xanthippus and Hamilcar Barca, which you may remember are locked in the mercenary pool. To accomplish this, Carthage must spend its political influence from the Miat. However, this action counts as a strategy card play. So instead of putting down a strategy card, the Carthaginian player announces that they would like to spend PC markers from the Miat. Basically, Carthage is using its political currency to buy one of these great generals into the game. The cost to buy a great general is shown on the blue sword icon on the turn track. These generals cannot be purchased in the first turn. However, from the second turn, buying a general costs 5 PC markers from the Miat. However, there's a bit of a catch with this. First, Xanthippus must be unlocked. Xanthippus must be displaced on the game board, and then Hamilcar Barca becomes available to purchase with political markers from the Miat. Also remember, by unlocking Xanthippus, Carthage regains their lost elephant knowledge. This removes the lost elephant knowledge marker from the Miat, and allows elephants to conduct battle charges without penalties. Now, a 5 PC marker cost to place one of these great generals is pretty expensive on the second turn, let alone that you need to do this twice to get to Hamilcar Barca. However, each subsequent turn, the blue sword price drops by 1, and by the last turn in the game, the Miat is apparently desperate and just gives you Hamilcar Barca. So even if you're only able to unlock Xanthippus, you will definitely be playing with Hamilcar Barca on the last turn of the game. Therefore, the player for Carthage will need to strategize their political expenditures with the Miat carefully if they want to bring Hamilcar Barca in as early as possible. Now let's look at Rome. The reinforcement process for Rome is much more straightforward. Rome can place 1 combat unit for each Roman-controlled province. This means that Rome can earn a maximum of 6 combat units for reinforcement. However, Rome must place these units under the following conditions. The first 2 combat units may be placed with any Roman general. Any additional combat units beyond 2 must be placed in Rome. Also, Roman combat unit reinforcements may be converted on a 1-to-1 basis for ready warships. While discussing the reinforcements for Rome, let's now look at their generals. Many of the generals used for Hamilcar now have special traits that affect gameplay. Hamilcar generals may have up to 3 traits in addition to any special ability. So let's walk through each trait and see how they work. To find out if a particular general has traits, look under their name on their leader card. Also note that generals may have multiple traits as well. Both Carthage and Rome may have generals with the Admiral trait. The Admiral trait allows a general to withdraw or retreat to the sea from a land battle. Roman generals have an additional ability to implement naval reforms. We'll talk about naval reforms in just a moment. The remaining 2 traits pertain only to Rome. They are the Aristocrat and Africanus traits. An aristocrat trait means that if the general is displaced, the player for Rome also loses political control markers equal to that general's battle rating. Finally, the Africanus trait means a general may always make a successful landing in Africa. A quick note, at this period in history, Rome had not conducted any real overseas expeditions. The Straits of Messina in Sicily was about as far as Rome had explored. Therefore, this rating reflects a general that is more confident in their abilities to mount such an expedition. As you can see from the seamanship panel for Rome, Rome cannot enter Africa until they've upgraded to at least good seamanship. However, a general with the Africanus trait can lead troops into Africa on their own. Now let's talk about some important changes to Roman consular elections. Roman consular elections have been updated for Hamilcar. The first big change is now every turn when the Senate recalls the consuls from the game board, those generals are removed permanently from the game. As a result, there is no chance for Roman generals to appear from card draws. Another change to the rules for Hamilcar is that Roman consuls now only require 3 combat units in their forces. With this in mind, remember that the Roman player may never take any voluntary action that would leave a consul or a consular army with less than these 3 combat units. One new feature in the Roman military structure for Hamilcar is the dictator role. The dictator election is triggered by playing strategy card number 80. If Carthage exceeds Rome's provincial points by 3, apparently the Senate relents and allows the player for Rome to select a Roman general with a 3 strategy rating and a 3 battle rating for the role of dictator. When this happens, place the dictator marker on the general card selected for the role. The new dictator will arrive in Rome and comes with 3 combat units. The dictator outranks all other Roman generals, which is useful when combining forces with other generals that are consuls. This also allows them to ignore change of command roles. The dictator is also not restricted by a minimum number of combat units that the consuls must hold. Therefore, they can absorb units from these consular armies that would drop their ranks below 3 combat units. The one drawback to this role is the dictator may not be retained as a proconsul and is removed at the end of the turn. Therefore, if you're going to elect a dictator, make sure you make the most use of them in the one turn that they're available. Next, let's finish up this phase by discussing naval reforms. Roman naval reforms become available if the Roman consul that is elected has the admiral trait. Most of these reform effects are tracked by the seamanship panel in the upper right-hand corner of the game board. The seamanship panel has 4 spaces that indicates Rome's skill. Rome begins the game with poor seamanship. Poor seamanship penalizes Rome's battle rolls with a -1 and makes their ships susceptible to storms. When Rome upgrades their seamanship to fair, this removes the storm penalty. When good seamanship is attained and Rome controls Syracuse, then Roman ships may travel to Africa. With excellent seamanship, Roman ships may travel to Africa without using Syracuse as a stepping stone. However, if Rome loses 5 ships in a turn, then their seamanship is degraded by 1 level. Now let's reset the marker and discuss ways that Rome can increase their seamanship. There are 3 ways that Rome can improve their seamanship by playing strategy cards. First, a strategy card with the double ship icon can be played to upgrade Rome's seamanship level. Number 2, strategy card number 92 can be played for the event. For those not familiar with the history, the Quinquereme shipwreck card can be a little baffling. My understanding of the event is that Rome found a wrecked Quinquereme ship. Rome then basically copied the design to improve their own ships. A neat little bit of history. The third way that Rome can improve their seamanship is by playing strategy card number 103 for the event, Naval Training Program. And finally, to bring us back on topic, Rome can improve their seamanship through naval reforms. Roman naval reforms have 4 options. First, the player for Rome can improve the nation's overall seamanship by 1 level. The second reform type is that the admiral can bring 1 ready ship with them as a reinforcement. Third, the admiral brings 3 ops points to refit ships. And fourth and finally, Rome can mount or dismount corvée on their ships. A corvus, which means raven in Latin, was a spiked boarding bridge. One end was mounted on the Roman ship, and the other was dropped on an opponent's ship. The bridge's spike buried itself in the enemy ship's deck and essentially nailed the two ships together. This device was called a corvus because the Romans believed the spike was like a crow's beak. Roman soldiers would then cross the bridge and board the enemy ship to attack. The drawback to the corvus, and why it was not widely used after the First Punic War, is that if the seas became rough, both ships were nailed together and could be wrecked. The corvus is tracked with a special marker placed on the space with a crow next to the seamanship panel. A quick note, corvus can instantly be mounted by playing strategy card number 107 for the event. When corvi are mounted, warships are more effective in battle, but less effective when attempting a naval interception. As a result, when the corvi is mounted, Rome adds 1 to all battle rolls and interception attempts. A mounted corvi also makes Roman ships less seaworthy. This can create additional danger to a Roman ship during a storm. Let's pause for a moment and see how storms work in Hamilcar. Okay, let's talk about storms. With strategy card number 101, the Carthage player may trigger a storm against Roman naval movement. If this occurs when Rome's seamanship is poor or a corvée is mounted on Roman ships, then they must roll on the attrition table. The attrition table is located in the upper left-hand corner of the game board. Also, for this example, I've highlighted the various sea routes on the board. Each of these sea routes may have one or more lightning bolt icons. These lightning bolts indicate the number of times the Roman player needs to roll on the attrition table. Therefore, Rome needs to keep these stormy routes in mind whenever they cross the sea or have their corvée mounted. During this phase, let's take a closer look at the turn track. In Hamilcar, the turn track only has 7 spaces. Each space has the name of the general that will be fielded for that turn. In setup, we added their general markers to the appropriate space. Below each space is an icon that indicates the number of strategy cards each player draws to build their hand for that turn. Next to the card number icon on turns 2 through 6 is the blue sword icon with a number. As a reminder, this number indicates the number of PC markers that must be spent from the Miat to pay for Xanthippus and Hamilcar Barca. Now, for strategy card plays, one change to the card layout to point out right away is the ship icons. Hamilcar does not limit naval movement to 3 op strategy cards. In this game, the ship icons now refer to the number of warships a player wants to spend the card to create. For example, the 1 ship icon allows the player to build 1 warship, and the 2 ship icon allows the player to build 2 warships. A 2 ship icon can also be spent to increase Rome's seamanship by 1 level. Now, let's talk about additional ways players can spend operation points from strategy card plays in Hamilcar. With the addition of warships in Hamilcar that can become spent from either combat or attrition, operation points can now be paid to refit those warships to ready status. A new marker introduced into Hamilcar is the supply train. A supply train can be created with excess operation points from playing a strategy card. For example, a player may put down a 3-point strategy card and spend 2 points to place PC markers, and then use the 3rd point to create a supply train. When a supply train is created, it can be placed in any walled city not under siege. Supply trains can also be placed with any of the player's armies. Supply trains can then be spent to benefit the player in a number of ways. They can be spent to add 1 point to a strategy card. They can be spent to pay for the difference between a strategy card and a higher level general. They also can be spent to cancel a die roll for an army suffering winter attrition, as well as spent during the war chest segment to balance the operational point total. Now let's look at some other rules that pertain to supply trains. Supply trains do not count towards the Army's size limit and can be moved by land and sea just like combat units. However, if an army is forced to retreat, they must abandon their supply trains. Also, enemy supply trains can be captured and converted to your side. This can occur if the supply train is abandoned by an army retreating, or if you conquer that army and then incorporate the remaining enemy supply trains into your forces. Supply trains can also be placed within a walled city during a siege. However, the garrison size of a walled city, that means the units that can take refuge within a walled city during a siege, is also the limit to the number of supply trains that can be stored there. This can be a little confusing, but what it means is that a walled city with a garrison limit of 2 can also protect 2 supply trains. Therefore, 2 combat units and 2 supply trains in the walled city. If things are looking particularly bleak for your army, you can also destroy your own supply trains. This can be done at the end of the war chest segment and costs 1 operation point. By spending 1 operation point, you can destroy any number of supply trains that you own. Supply trains allow a lot of flexibility in the game when spending strategy cards for operation points. Keep this in mind as you plan out your strategy for winning the game. The winter attrition phase remains mostly the same from Hannibal, with a few exceptions. The first change: in Hamilcar, Carthage conducts winter attrition first, and then Rome. Next, if a combat unit is in a hostile space and vulnerable to winter attrition, and has a supply train marker, they can spend that supply train marker to avoid a winter attrition roll. Finally, all ready warships are vulnerable to winter naval attrition. To complete winter naval attrition, count up the ready warships and conduct a die roll on that column on the attrition table. The result on the table is the number of warships that become spent. Winter naval attrition is also unavoidable, so you cannot use supply trains to buffer against die rolls. Keep these new rules in mind when playing through the winter attrition phase. The victory check is conducted much in the same way in Hamilcar as in Hannibal. The turn track and what is listed for eligible provinces is tallied up for both sides. There are a total of 14 provincial points available, 1 for each eligible province, 1 point for controlling the walled city of Lilybaeum, 1 point for the side with naval supremacy, and 1 point for Carthage alone if they control the Miat. Each side tallies their points, and the smaller side's provincial points are then deducted from the larger sides, and the loser must reduce their political markers by that number. Remember, for Carthage, those political losses must be first removed from the Miat. However, one addition to this phase is the integration of the war chest segment, so let's take a look at that next. The war chest segment is at the end of the victory check phase. This is basically a balancing mechanic against luck, but the theme is that increased action on one side of a conflict triggers more military expenditure on the other side. From a design perspective, the war chest is also a complementary function to the victory check, which has political outcomes, while the war chest has military implications. With all that said, let's discuss how it works. Each player must add up the total operational point value of the strategy cards they've played during the turn. The totals of both sides are compared. The key here is the difference between the two, which will award the player with less points. In our example here, Rome has a total of 15 operation points and Carthage has 13. The difference between the two is going to boost Carthage's war economy. Differences in the total can be mitigated by spending supply trains. Each supply train spent is worth 1 point towards the war chest. When the totals are finaled, the player with the lower amount, in this example Carthage, is awarded operational points to spend. The player can then purchase the following during this segment: 1 supply train at a cost of 1 operation point each. As you recall earlier, the player can also spend 1 operation points to destroy 1 or more of the supply trains they own. 1 warship can be refitted from spent to ready at a cost of 1 operation point each. A new ready warship can be brought into the game for a cost of 3 operation points. A new combat unit can be brought into the game for 3 operation points. And finally, Carthage can spend their operation points to place PC markers on the Miat. And that's how the war chest segment works in Hamilcar. Phase 7 is the end of the game turn. From this point, players will return to Phase 1 and play through the cycle again. The conditions for winning Hamilcar mirror Hannibal's winning conditions, with the exception that in the event of a tie, Carthage wins. And now that we've covered off on all the differences in the phases of gameplay, we're ready to look at the major change to this game, which is the naval battles and movement. This concludes our second episode focused on the Hamilcar portion of Hannibal and Hamilcar by Phalanx. In the next episode, we will look at the naval portion of the game. If you like this content and would like to see more, be sure to hit the like button and then ring the bell for notifications. As always, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.